In the shadow of endless highways that cut through America's heartland, Jerry's truck stop held a secret that would shake the criminal underworld to its core. When Snake and his notorious biker gang decided to target Sam Mitchell, a mute waitress whose silence they mistook for weakness, they had no idea they were about to awaken a legend. One desperate call would bring forth her brother Ethan, known in shadow circles as the Ghost, an operative so lethal that hardened criminals spoke his name in whispers. What began as cruel harassment would evolve into an extraordinary tale of redemption, forever changing both siblings' lives. Snake's gang came hunting for easy prey, but found themselves facing a woman whose silence held more strength than their violence, and a brother whose return from the darkness would remind him what he was truly fighting for. This is the story of how a sister's unwavering courage and a brother's lethal skills turned a simple truck stop into hallowed ground, a place where silence became power, and where those who preyed on the vulnerable learned that the most dangerous force wasn't the shadow they feared, but the light they never saw coming. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for tomorrow's special episode. The fluorescent lights of Jerry's truck stop cut through the pre-dawn darkness like a lighthouse in a sea of shadows. Miles of empty highway stretched in every direction, with nothing but dense pine forests and the occasional glimmer of distant headlights to break the monotony. Inside, the quiet hum of the coffee maker and the gentle clink of cutlery created a familiar symphony that Sam had grown to love over the years. Sam moved between the tables with practiced grace, her notepad and pen hanging from a chain at her waist. Her honey blonde hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and her blue uniform dress was crisp despite the long hours of her shift. A trucker at table 3 caught her eye and tapped his coffee cup. Sam nodded, her lips curving into a warm smile as she grabbed the coffee pot. "Thanks, darlin'," the trucker, Mike, said as she topped off his cup. Sam pulled out her notepad and quickly wrote, "Need anything else?" Her handwriting was neat and precise, developed over years of necessity. Mike shook his head. "I'm good, Sam. You take care now." The regulars had grown used to Sam's silence over the years, accepting her notepad communications as just another quirk of Jerry's truck stop. Some even preferred it, finding comfort in her quiet presence during their long, lonely hauls across the country. Marge, the elderly cook who'd been at Jerry's even longer than Sam, poked her head through the kitchen window. "Order up for table 6. Her voice carried the raspy warmth of someone who'd spent decades calling out orders and sharing gossip over the griddle. As Sam collected the plate of eggs and hash browns, her mind drifted back to the accident 5 years ago. The screech of tires, the shattering glass, the acrid smell of burning rubber. The hospital room had been too white, too sterile. The doctor's words echoed in her head, "The trauma to your vocal cords. I'm sorry, but the damage is permanent." She'd spent weeks after that trying to force sounds past her lips, crying silent tears of frustration as nothing came out. Her brother Ethan had already been gone by then, lost to his own dark world of classified missions and radio silence. Sam shook off the memory as she delivered the plate to table 6. The present was what mattered now. She'd built a life here, carved out her own little space in the world. The regulars were like family. Joe, the retired mechanic who always ordered the same breakfast at 5 a.m. sharp. Marge, who'd taken Sam under her wing from day one. Even old Pete, who drove the overnight haul from Phoenix and never failed to leave her a generous tip. The quiet of the early morning was shattered by the thunderous roar of motorcycles. The sound grew louder until it felt like the whole building was vibrating. Through the wide front windows, Sam watched as 6 bikes pulled into the lot, their chrome gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The riders were all leather and attitude, their bikes adorned with enough skulls and spikes to stock a Halloween store. The leader cut his engine first, the sudden silence almost as jarring as the noise had been. He was tall, with broad shoulders and arms covered in faded tattoos. A snake design wound its way up his neck, disappearing into his graying beard. When he pulled off his helmet, his eyes were cold and calculating, scanning the diner like a predator, sizing up its prey. The bell above the door chimed as Snake and his gang filed in, boots heavy on the linoleum floor. The few customers present suddenly became very interested in their meals, heads down, shoulders tense. Sam felt the shift in the atmosphere immediately, like a storm front moving in, heavy with the promise of trouble. Snake's gaze landed on Sam, and something in his expression made her skin crawl. His lips curved into what might have been a smile, but there was nothing friendly about it. Well, he drawled. What do we have here? One of his gang, a younger man with a ratty leather vest, laughed. Looks like we found ourselves a proper truck stop angel. Sam straightened her spine and approached their table, notepad ready. Professional. Calm. She'd dealt with difficult customers before. Snake sprawled in the booth, taking up more space than necessary, while his men crowded around. What's the matter, sweetheart? Snake's voice dripped with mock concern. Cat got your tongue? The gang snickered, and Sam began to write their drink orders, her hand steady despite the tension coursing through her body. Snake snatched the notepad from her hands, examining it with exaggerated interest. Oh, boys, looks like we got ourselves a mime. He held up the notepad like a trophy. What's wrong with you, girl? Too good to talk to paying customers. From across the diner, Joe's chair scraped against the floor as he stood up. He was in his 60s, but still solid from years of working on engines. Leave the girl alone, he said, his voice quiet but firm. She's just trying to do her job. Snake's head turned slowly toward Joe, his eyes narrowing. This conversation doesn't concern you, old man. The threat in his voice was clear as winter ice. Joe took a step forward anyway. Sam's a good kid. She doesn't need any trouble. Trouble? Snake's laugh was ugly. Who's causing trouble? We're just trying to have a friendly chat with the help. He turned back to Sam, who was still standing there, face composed but heart racing. Aren't we, sweetheart? One of the bikers, a heavy-set man with a skull tattoo on his bald head, grabbed Sam's wrist. Maybe she just needs the right motivation to speak up. Sam pulled her arm free, taking a step back. She could feel Marge watching from the kitchen, could hear her picking up the phone, probably trying to call the sheriff, though the nearest station was 30 minutes away at best. Look at that, Snake said, picking up Sam's notepad again. She's got some spirit after all. He pulled out a pen and wrote something on the pad, then held it up for his gang to see. Their laughter was like broken glass. Sam couldn't see what he'd written, but she didn't need to. The way the other customers averted their eyes told her enough. She reached for the notepad, but Snake held it away. He said, I think I'll hold on to this. Might need to leave you some more messages before we're done here. The morning light was starting to creep in through the windows, painting the parking lot in shades of gray and pink. Sam could see a few truckers hurrying to their rigs, heads down, pretending not to notice what was happening inside. She couldn't blame them. Snake and his gang radiated danger like a furnace radiates heat. Joe was still standing, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Sam, he called out, why don't you go help Marge in the kitchen for a bit? Snake's eyes glittered. Sam's not going anywhere. We haven't even ordered yet. He patted the seat next to him. Why don't you take a load off, Sam? Let's get to know each other better. The other bikers spread out around the diner, effectively blocking the exits. They weren't even pretending to be customers anymore. This was about power, about finding someone vulnerable and making themselves feel big by making her feel small. Sam stood her ground, years of silence giving her a strength they couldn't understand. She'd lost her voice, yes, but she hadn't lost herself. She met Snake's eyes steadily, refusing to show fear. Oh, look at that, boys. Snake's voice took on a dangerous edge. Little Miss Mute thinks she's tough. He stood up slowly, unfolding himself to his full height. Maybe we need to stick around for a while. Teach her some proper respect. The morning sun was fully up now, streaming through the windows and catching on the chrome of the motorcycles outside. In its harsh light, Snake's gang looked even more menacing, all leather and metal and bad intentions. They'd found their entertainment for the day, and Sam knew with cold certainty that they weren't going to let it go easily. Snake took a step toward her, close enough that she could smell leather and cigarette smoke. We're going to have ourselves a real interesting day, sweetheart. He glanced around the diner, taking in the scared faces of the customers, Joe's impotent anger, the phone in Marge's trembling hands. And nobody's going to do a damn thing about it. Sam's hand went to her throat, an unconscious gesture she'd never quite broken. Somewhere in the kitchen, a plate crashed to the floor, the sound making everyone jump. Snake's gang laughed, the sound echoing off the walls like gunshots. The morning that had started like any other had turned into something dark and dangerous, and Sam knew that before it was over, She would have to make a choice. Stay silent and hope they eventually got bored, or reach out to the one person she'd sworn she'd never call again. As Snake's shadow fell across her, she realized that choice might already have been made for her. What she didn't know, couldn't know, was that her next decision would set in motion a chain of events that would change everything, not just for her, but for everyone at Jerry's truck stop. The day was just beginning, and somewhere out there a phone was waiting to ring. The sound of motorcycles rumbling in the parking lot seemed to grow louder, like thunder before a storm. Sam stood in the middle of her diner, surrounded by danger, knowing that whatever happened next would depend entirely on her. Sometimes, she thought, the hardest battles are the ones fought in silence. The morning sun cast long shadows across Jerry's truck stop as Snake's gang settled in for what was becoming their own twisted form of entertainment. The initial wave of customers had fled, leaving only a handful of regulars trapped inside. Razor, the youngest of Snake's crew, positioned himself by the glass door, his leather vest creaking as he crossed his arms. The message was clear: nobody was leaving without Snake's permission. The other bikers spread out strategically throughout the diner. Skull, the heavy-set man with the distinctive head tattoo, lounged near the kitchen entrance, occasionally making kissing noises at Marge whenever she peeked out. Two others, whom Snake had called Diesel and Wrench, cleared a table by simply shoving everything onto the floor, the crash of plates adding to the growing tension. The last member of Snake's crew, a tall, wiry man with a prosthetic hand nicknamed Hook, prowled between the booths, running his metal appendage along the vinyl seats with a sound like nails on a chalkboard. The noise set everyone's teeth on edge, which seemed to be exactly what he wanted. Sam moved through this nightmare with mechanical precision, her steps measured and deliberate as she collected broken pieces of ceramic from the floor. Her uniform was already stained with spilled coffee, but her movements remained steady, almost ritualistic, as if maintaining order could somehow restore normalcy to this situation. "Hey, sweetheart," Diesel called out, his voice thick with mock sweetness. "Why don't you come give our table a real good cleaning?" He deliberately knocked over his water glass, liquid spreading across the formica surface and dripping onto the floor. Sam kept her eyes down, focusing on the task at hand. 5 years of silence had taught her patience, had shown her how to withdraw into herself when necessary. Each piece of broken plate she picked up was a small act of defiance. They could create chaos, but they couldn't make her stop doing her job. Snake watched her from his corner booth, a half-smile playing on his lips as he observed her methodical movements. "You know what I think, boys," he drawled, voice carrying across the now-quiet diner. "I think our little mime here thinks she's better than us. Too good to even acknowledge us properly." A whimper came from one of the booths where an elderly couple, the Hendersons, sat frozen in fear. They were regular breakfast customers, usually in and out before the morning rush. Now they were trapped in this nightmare, Mr. Henderson's hand clutching his wife's so tight his knuckles had gone white. Joe, who had been watching everything from his usual spot at the counter, finally pushed his coffee cup away. His weathered face was set in grim lines as he stood up, joints creaking slightly. At 65, he wasn't the man he used to be, but there was still strength in his frame from decades of mechanical work. "That's enough," he said, voice carrying the weight of years of commanded respect at his old auto shop. "You've had your fun. Time to move on." Snake's eyes glittered with malicious amusement. "Would you listen to that, boys? The old-timer thinks he can tell us what to do." He stood up slowly, unfolding his tall frame. "You got something to say to me, old man?" Joe moved deliberately, positioning himself between Snake and Sam, who had straightened up from her cleaning, clutching her dish towel like a shield. "I said that's enough. The girl can't speak. Making fun of her doesn't make you tough. It makes you pathetic." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Snake's amusement vanished, replaced by something cold and dangerous. "Pathetic, huh?" He looked around at his crew. "Boys, I think it's time we taught Grandpa here some manners." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion, yet was over in seconds. Skull and Hook converged on Joe from different angles. The old mechanic managed to land one solid punch, catching Hook in the jaw and sending him stumbling backward. But then Skull's massive fist connected with Joe's kidney, and the fight turned ugly. Sam moved to intervene, but Diesel caught her arm, spinning her around so she had to watch. The sound of fists hitting flesh echoed through the diner, punctuated by the Hendersons' frightened gasps and Marge's muffled scream from the kitchen. Joe hit the floor hard, but they didn't stop. Boot after boot connected with his ribs, his back, his legs. Blood sprayed across the checkered linoleum when Skull's steel-toed boot caught Joe's face. Through it all, Joe didn't make a sound, as if he was determined to show as much dignity in his beating as Sam showed in her silence. Finally, Snake held up a hand. Enough. The beating stopped, leaving Joe motionless on the floor, blood pooling around his head like a grotesque halo. Let her go, Snake commanded, and Diesel released Sam's arm. Sam didn't hesitate. She dropped to her knees beside Joe, not caring about the blood soaking into her uniform. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking his pulse, his breathing, turning him gently onto his side to help him breathe. Silent tears rolled down her cheeks, but her movements remained steady and professional. This wasn't the first injury she'd treated, though it was by far the worst. Joe's eyes fluttered open, focusing on her face with difficulty through swollen lids. He tried to speak, but only managed a wet cough that brought out more blood. Sam pulled her notepad from her pocket, writing quickly, "Don't try to talk. Help is coming." But even as she wrote it, she knew it wasn't true. The nearest hospital was an hour away, and the local sheriff's deputy wouldn't dare confront Snake's gang alone. Snake's shadow fell across them both. "Touching," he sneered. "Real touching." He crouched down next to Sam, his mouth close to her ear. "You know what the best part is, sweetheart? This is just the beginning. We're going to take a little ride now, let things cool down, but we'll be back tonight." His voice dropped even lower, meant for her ears alone. "And then you and me are going to have a real special conversation about respect." Sam turned her head slowly, meeting his gaze. In her eyes was a fire that seemed to surprise him. Not fear, not submission, but pure, burning defiance. For a moment, Snake's mask slipped, showing a flash of uncertainty before his cruel smile returned. "Boys," he called out, straightening up, "I think it's time we gave this place a proper sending off." What followed was pure destruction. Hook and Diesel flipped tables while Skull methodically smashed every piece of electronic equipment in sight. The cash register crashed to the floor, springs and gears scattering across the tile. Razor took particular pleasure in shattering the coffee pots, sending glass and hot coffee everywhere. Sam's cell phone was next, Snake making a show of dropping it into a glass of water before crushing it under his boot. "Can't have you calling for help. Now can we?" He smirked. "Though I suppose it's not really your strong suit anyway." The Hendersons huddled in their booth, Mrs. Henderson quietly praying while her husband tried to make himself as small as possible. Marge had barricaded herself in the kitchen, the sound of her sobs barely audible over the destruction. Finally, Snake seemed satisfied with the chaos they'd created. "Mount up, boys," he called out. "We've got some preparation to do for tonight's entertainment." The gang filed out, their boots crunching over broken glass and ceramic. The roar of their motorcycles starting up was almost a relief, a signal that this particular nightmare was temporarily over. As they pulled away, their laughter carried back on the wind like the howl of wolves. In the aftermath, the silence was deafening. Sam remained kneeling beside Joe, her uniform now soaked with blood and coffee, her hands trembling as the adrenaline began to wear off. The morning sun streamed through the windows, highlighting the devastation: broken furniture, shattered glass, destroyed equipment, and the dark stains of spilled coffee and blood on the floor. Mrs. Henderson's prayers had devolved into quiet weeping, the sound somehow worse than the chaos that had preceded it. Mr. Henderson finally found his voice. We should call someone. The police, an ambulance." Sam shook her head. She knew better. The gang would have people watching the roads. Any official response would just give them another target, another excuse for violence. Besides, the landline had been ripped from the wall, and everyone's cell phones had been systematically destroyed. Marge finally emerged from the kitchen, her face streaked with tears and flour. "Oh, Sam," she whispered. "Oh, Joe, what are we going to do?" Sam's hands were still shaking as she wrote on her notepad, "Get the first aid kit. We need to take care of Joe first." Her writing was barely legible, but Marge understood, hurrying back to the kitchen. As she waited, Sam's mind raced through options, each one darker than the last. Snake's promise to return hung in the air like poison gas, seeping into every corner of the destroyed diner. She knew with terrible certainty that next time would be worse. Much worse. Slowly, she stood up. Her legs felt like rubber, but they carried her to the storage room at the back of the diner. Behind boxes of paper towels and cleaning supplies was a loose panel in the wall. Sam's fingers found it automatically, pulling it free to reveal a small cavity. Inside was a satellite phone, dust-covered but intact. Ethan had given it to her years ago, just before he disappeared into whatever shadow world had claimed him. For emergencies only, he'd said. When everything else fails, this will reach me. Sam stared at the phone, her heart pounding. Using it meant crossing a line she'd sworn she'd never cross again. Ethan's world was dark, violent. Everything she'd tried to leave behind. Calling him would be like opening a door that could never truly be closed again. But then she heard Joe's labored breathing from the dining room, saw again in her mind the cruel promise in Snake's eyes. She thought about the elderly Hendersons, about Marge, about all the other people who could get caught in the crossfire when Snake and his gang returned. Her hands had stopped shaking as she powered on the phone. The screen lit up with a soft blue glow, and her fingers moved across the keypad with surprising steadiness. She typed out a simple message, one she and Ethan had agreed upon years ago. Code black. Truck stop. Need you. For a long moment, her thumb hovered over the send button. In that pause was every argument she'd ever had with herself about violence and peace, about revenge and justice, about the price of safety and the cost of vengeance. Then she heard Mrs. Henderson's continued prayers, heard Marge's gentle murmuring as she tended to Joe, and her decision crystallized. Sometimes silence wasn't enough. Sometimes you had to make a choice between bad options and worse ones. Sam pressed send. The message disappeared into the ether, racing across satellite networks to wherever Ethan was, carrying with it a plea for help, and, though Sam didn't fully realize it yet, a catalyst for events that would change everything. As she tucked the phone in her apron pocket, she felt something shift inside her, not just fear or determination, but a grim acceptance of what was to come. In the growing heat of the morning, the broken diner seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Outside, the sun climbed higher in the sky, marking the hours until Snake's promised return. But now, for the first time since the bikers had arrived, there was something else in the air besides fear. Hope, dangerous and sharp as broken glass, had entered the equation. Sam returned to the dining room, to Joe's side, to the task of cleaning up what could be cleaned. But her hand kept straying to the satellite phone in her pocket, like touching a loaded gun, dangerous, but reassuring in its deadliness. The message was sent. Now all they could do was wait, and pray that whatever darkness Ethan brought with him would be enough to counter the darkness that was coming with the night. High in the mountains of Montana, where the air was thin and the solitude absolute, Ethan Mitchell was doing what he'd done every morning for the past 3 years, trying to forget. The rhythm of his punches against the heavy bag echoed through the sparse cabin, each impact carrying the weight of memories he couldn't quite shake. Sweat dripped from his close-cropped dark hair despite the morning chill, his muscled frame moving with the fluid precision of someone who'd made violence their life's work. The cabin itself was barely more than a shelter, a bed, a weapons bench, and enough survival gear to withstand a siege. Through the window, endless pine forests stretched toward snow-capped peaks, the isolation both a punishment and a refuge. This far up the mountain, even cell phones were useless. That's why he'd chosen it. The satellite phone's buzz was like a gunshot in the silence. Ethan's fist stopped mid-strike, his body tensing automatically at the unexpected sound. Nobody had that number. Nobody except. He pushed the thought away, crossing to where the phone lay buried under maps and maintenance logs. For a moment, he just stared at it, his scarred hands hovering over the device as if it might bite. Finally, he picked it up. The message was short, just text, but the words hit harder than any punch. Code black. Truck stop. Need you. Sam, he whispered, the name feeling strange on his lips after so long. Code black, their private signal established years ago. Absolute danger. No question about the response needed. For a moment, he was thrown back in time, to a summer afternoon 20 years ago. Sam, 12 years old, her blonde hair and messy pigtails, practicing the hand signals he'd taught her. "But why do I need to know this stuff?" she'd asked, struggling to remember the sequence. "Because sometimes you can't yell for help," he'd told her, already in his military fatigues, already carrying the weight of what he was becoming. "Sometimes you need a way to tell me you're in trouble without saying a word." She'd rolled her eyes, but kept practicing. "Like I'll ever need secret codes. You worry too much, E. That's what big brothers are for, squirt." The memory shattered as Ethan slammed the phone down, his mind racing. Sam wouldn't use code black unless it was life or death. She hadn't contacted him in 5 years, not since the accident that took her voice, not since he'd missed their parents' funeral because of a classified operation he still couldn't talk about. He paced the cabin's length, conflict written in every line of his body. The last time he'd seen Sam, she'd written him a note. "Don't come back unless you're ready to be my brother again, not just a shadow with a gun." Was he ready? The question gnawed at him as he moved to the weapons bench, his hands automatically beginning to field strip and clean his custom Sig Sauer. The familiar motions helped him think, helped him process the storm of emotions the message had unleashed. "Damn it, Sam," he muttered, reassembling the pistol with practiced ease. "What have you gotten yourself into?" Another memory surfaced. Sam at 16, proudly showing him the college acceptance letter he'd helped her apply for. He'd promised to be there for her graduation. 2 weeks before the ceremony, his team had been deployed on a black op in Southeast Asia. He'd missed that too. Ethan moved to a specific floorboard, one that looked no different from the others, but concealed a compartment he'd installed his first week in the cabin. Inside was everything he'd tried to leave behind. Fake passports, encrypted phones, enough weapons to start a small war, and a leather folder containing newspaper clippings he'd never been able to throw away. He pulled out the folder, flipping through articles that never mentioned his name, but told the story of his career and body counts and mysterious incidents. The ghost, they called him in certain circles. The operative who could get in and out of anywhere, eliminate any target, without leaving a trace. The newest clipping was from 3 years ago, a cartel leadership meeting in Mexico that had ended in unexplained explosions. 17 dead, no suspects identified. It had been his last mission before he'd walked away, before the cost of being the ghost had finally become too high. But now Sam needed him. Not the ghost, not the shadow operator, but her brother. The question was, could he be both? Ethan began to pack, his movements economical and precise. The Sig went into a custom holster, followed by a backup piece at his ankle. Ceramic knives that wouldn't trigger metal detectors. Tactical gear chosen for mobility rather than protection. A medical kit that had seen too much use. As he worked, fragments of intel briefings flickered through his mind. Motorcycle gangs controlling stretches of highway, trafficking operations disguised as legitimate businesses, corrupt local law enforcement turning a blind eye. The truck stop would be vulnerable, isolated. Perfect territory for predators. He checked his watch. If he pushed it, he could make it to the truck stop by nightfall. The question was, would that be soon enough? Meanwhile, back at Jerry's truck stop, Sam moved through the wreckage with determined focus, though her hands shook slightly as she swept up broken glass. The message she'd sent felt like a live wire in her mind, electricity crackling with possibility and danger. Marge watched from behind the counter, wringing her dish towel nervously. "Sam, honey, maybe we should close up. Just lock the doors and go home until this blows over." Sam shook her head, pulling out her notepad. Her writing was steady despite her trembling hands. "Can't leave. They'll just destroy more. Need to be here." What she couldn't write, couldn't explain, was that she needed to be there if Ethan arrived. The satellite phone felt heavy in her pocket, a weight made of equal parts hope and dread. The Hendersons had finally left an hour ago, Mr. Henderson helping his still-praying wife to their car. "We'll call the police from home," he'd promised, but Sam knew it wouldn't matter. Snake's gang would have people watching the roads, monitoring police frequencies. Help wouldn't come from that direction. Joe had been taken to the hospital by his son, Tony, who'd arrived just after the bikers left. The look in Tony's eyes had been murderous when he saw his father's condition, but Sam's note had been clear. Don't do anything. Not yet. Help is coming. Now, as afternoon crept toward evening, even the regular customers were staying away. Word had spread fast about Snake's gang. The parking lot, usually full of trucks and travelers, was eerily empty. Sam paused in her cleaning to stare out the window at the setting sun. Somewhere out there, Ethan was either coming or he wasn't. She tried to picture him as she'd last seen him, lean and hard, his eyes carrying shadows she couldn't understand. Would he be different now? Would he come at all? Back in Montana, Ethan was already on the move. His truck, a nondescript Ford that had been modified in ways that weren't street legal, ate up the miles as he pushed it to its limits. The satellite phone lay on the passenger seat, silent now, but somehow still screaming with urgency. He found himself thinking about the last time he'd seen Sam, just after the accident that took her voice. The hospital corridor had been too bright, too sterile. He'd stood outside her room for 10 minutes, still in his tactical gear, still carrying cordite residue from the operation he'd just completed. When he'd finally entered, Sam had been sitting up in bed, bandages around her throat, her eyes full of accusations he couldn't answer. She'd written on her notepad, "Where were you?" He hadn't had an answer then. He still didn't. The memory fueled his acceleration, the truck's engine growling as he pushed it harder. In the back, his gears shifted slightly, enough firepower to start a war, not that he'd need it all. The ghost had never been about overwhelming force. He was something worse, precision violence, targeted devastation, the knife in the dark rather than the bomb in the square. A different memory surfaced, his first handler in the agency explaining his new code name. "You're not just good at being invisible, Mitchell. You're good at making other people disappear. Like a ghost, see? They're there, then they're not, and nobody can prove anything." The name had stuck, spreading through the shadow world like a whisper. The ghost. The operative who solved problems permanently and left no evidence. The man who could make anyone vanish without a trace. But Sam didn't need the ghost. She needed her brother, the one who'd taught her to fish, who'd helped her with her homework, who'd promised to always protect her. Promises he'd broken, one by one, as the darkness of his work had consumed him. The sun was setting now, painting the highway in shades of blood and gold. Ethan checked his watch again, calculating distances, timing, possibilities. He'd make it, but it would be close. Too close. At the truck stop, Sam had finally finished cleaning what could be cleaned. The broken equipment was piled in one corner, the salvageable furniture rearranged to hide the gaps. She'd mopped up the blood, but she could still see it if she looked too closely at the floor. Marge approached her cautiously. "Sam, it's getting dark. Please, let's just go. Whatever you're waiting for. It's not worth risking your life over." Sam pulled out her notepad again. "You should go home, Marge." "I'll be okay." "Like hell you will," Marge snapped, her fear making her voice sharp. "You didn't see how Snake was looking at you. He means to hurt you, girl. Real bad." Sam's hand went to the satellite phone in her pocket. She wrote again, "I know, but help is coming." Marge stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "It's that brother of yours, isn't it? The one you never talk about." Sam nodded, not trusting herself to write more. "Will he really come?" Sam met Marge's eyes and nodded again, with more conviction than she felt. Because that was the question that had been eating at her since she'd sent the message. Would Ethan really come? After all this time, all the silence, all the broken promises, would he answer this one last call? The sun had set completely now, the parking lot illuminated only by flickering fluorescent lights. Every passing motorcycle sound made them jump, though so far it had just been regular traffic. But they both knew it was only a matter of time before Snake and his gang returned. Marge finally left, extracting a promise from Sam to call the police if anything happened. Sam had nodded, not bothering to remind her that all the phones were destroyed. She stood at the window now, watching Marge's taillights disappear into the gathering darkness. The truck stop felt impossibly huge and empty without its usual crowd of customers. Every shadow seemed to hold menace. Every creak of the old building sounded like approaching footsteps. Sam found herself straining to hear the rumble of motorcycles, knowing they were coming, but not knowing when. She pulled out the satellite phone again, checking it for the 100th time. No new messages. Nothing to indicate that Ethan had even received her call for help. The doubt crept in again, wrapped in memories of all the times he hadn't been there, all the moments when his shadow life had taken precedence over his family. But then she remembered other things too. Ethan teaching her to defend herself when she was young, showing her how to break holds and escape grabs. teaching her the importance of awareness, of having backup plans, of never giving up no matter how bad things looked. The world's full of predators, Sam, he told her once. But that doesn't mean you have to be prey. Now, standing in the empty diner with night pressing against the windows, Sam held on to that memory. She wasn't prey. She was a survivor. And somewhere out there, she had to believe her brother was coming. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their harsh glare creating pools of light and shadow across the linoleum floor. Every now and then, a car would pass on the highway, its headlights sweeping across the windows like searching fingers before disappearing into the night. Sam checked the clock again. It had been 12 hours since she'd sent the message. 12 hours since she'd reached out to the brother she'd sworn she'd never call. 12 hours of cleaning and waiting and hoping and fearing. Soon, Snake and his gang would return. Soon, she would find out if her faith in Ethan was justified, or if she'd made a terrible mistake in waiting instead of running. Soon, everything would change, for better or worse. The night deepened, stars appearing in the vast sky above the truck stop. Sam stood at the window, her silhouette clear against the diner's lights, watching and waiting. In her pocket, the satellite phone remained silent, but somewhere on the dark highways, a nondescript truck was eating up the miles, driven by a man who had once been called Ghost. As Ethan's truck ate up the dark miles toward Jerry's truck stop, his mind drifted back to the mission that had changed everything. 3 years ago, in the sweltering heat of a Mexican summer night, Operation Kingsnake had gone terribly wrong. The target was Miguel Ramirez, a cartel leader whose organization had expanded beyond drugs into human trafficking. Ethan's orders were simple: eliminate Ramirez during a meeting with his lieutenants. Clean, quick, untraceable. The kind of mission that had earned him the nickname Ghost. The compound was a sprawling hacienda in the hills outside Culiacan. Ethan had spent weeks planning the infiltration, studying patrol patterns, identifying weaknesses. Everything was perfect, until it wasn't. Ghost, be advised, Martinez's voice had crackled in his earpiece. Intel shows additional civilians on site. Possible family members. Control, requesting mission abort. Ethan had responded, his fingers steady on the trigger of his rifle. Negative, Ghost. Window of opportunity is now. Execute mission. Ethan's crosshairs had settled on Ramirez's head. The cartel leader was laughing, drinking with his men in the courtyard. And then a little girl had run up to him, his daughter, no more than 6 years old, clutching a stuffed animal. Control, we have children present. Repeat, children on site. Understood, Ghost. Proceed with mission. The memory of what happened next still haunted him. He'd adjusted his aim, trying to wait for a clear shot that wouldn't risk the child. But then one of Ramirez's men had spotted something, raised the alarm. The courtyard erupted into chaos. What followed was a nightmare of muzzle flashes and screams. Ramirez used his own daughter as a shield, firing blindly at Ethan's position. The girl's terrified cries mixed with the gunfire. When the fuel tank of a nearby vehicle exploded, hit by a stray round, the flames engulfed everything. In the end, Ramirez was dead. So were his lieutenants. And so were 3 innocent people, including the little girl with the stuffed animal. The steering wheel creaked under Ethan's grip as the memory faded. The debriefing that followed had been worse in its own way. Acceptable losses, Colonel Richards had said, reviewing the mission report. The words fell like stones in the sterile conference room. The mission was accomplished. Ramirez is dead. His organization is in chaos. That's what matters. Ethan had stood at attention, his face a mask. Sir, with respect, there were children. There are always children, Mitchell. Richards cut him off. There are always civilians. That's the nature of our work. We make the hard call so others don't have to. We're supposed to be the good guys, Ethan had said, his voice barely controlled. Richards had looked at him with something like pity. We're not the good guys or the bad guys, Mitchell. We're the necessary guys. The ones who do what needs to be done. That night, Ethan had cleaned out his locker, turned in his credentials, and disappeared into the mountains. He'd thought he was done with violence, done with making hard calls that cost innocent lives. But now, as another memory surfaced, he realized he'd just been running from one failure to protect the innocent to another. The call about Sam's accident had come while he was deep undercover in Southeast Asia. By the time he got the message, She'd already been in the hospital for 3 days. The drunk driver who'd hit her car had walked away without a scratch. Sam had survived, but her vocal cords were irreparably damaged. When he finally made it to the hospital, she was already being discharged. The look in her eyes when she saw him, disappointment mixed with resignation, had cut deeper than any wound he'd received in the field. She'd written on her notepad, "Mom and Dad's funeral was last week. Thanks for coming to that, too." The sarcasm was clear even in writing. Their parents had died in a boating accident 6 months earlier. He'd been in deep cover then, too, unreachable. By the time he surfaced, they were already in the ground. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, empty except for his headlights cutting through the darkness. Ethan checked his watch again, still 3 hours out from the truck stop. His mind wandered to the aftermath of Sam's accident. He'd tried to stay, to help her adjust. But she'd pushed him away, tired of his guilt, his attempts to fix what couldn't be fixed. While she learned to navigate her new silent world, he'd retreated into what he knew best, the shadow world of classified missions and deniable operations. Sam had shown remarkable strength during her recovery. She'd learned sign language, though few around her knew it. She developed her own systems of communication, refusing to let her disability define or limit her. She'd taken the job at Jerry's truck stop, built a life for herself. Meanwhile, Ethan had built his reputation. The ghost became a legend in certain circles, the operative who could make entire enemy cells disappear overnight. There were whispered stories about a mission in Jakarta where he'd eliminated a terrorist network of 12 men in under 3 minutes. About a night in Prague when he'd infiltrated a heavily guarded compound and extracted a high-value target without firing a shot. A gas station appeared ahead, and Ethan pulled in to refuel. As he stood in the fluorescent glare, watching the numbers climb on the pump, he thought about Sam's message again. Code black. Truck stop. Need you. Simple words that carried the weight of years of silence, years of missed opportunities, years of choosing the mission over family. This wasn't just a call for help. It was a chance to be the brother he should have been all along. Inside the truck, his gear waited, tools of a trade he'd tried to leave behind. The weapons were clean, maintained out of habit rather than necessity. The tactical gear was still fitted to his specifications. The ghost had never really left. He'd just been waiting in the shadows of Ethan's consciousness. Back on the highway, his thoughts turned to the confrontation ahead. The old instincts were surfacing, analyzing angles of approach, considering points of cover, planning for contingencies. But this time was different. This time it wasn't about following orders or completing a mission. This time it was personal. Meanwhile, at Jerry's truck stop, Sam continued her vigil. The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward midnight, each second an eternity of waiting. She cleaned everything she could, straightened everything that could be straightened. Now she just watched the empty parking lot, jumping at every distant sound of engines. Their struggles ran parallel. Sam's silent determination to survive whatever the night might bring. Ethan's desperate race to reach her before it was too late. Both of them carried scars from the past, both visible and hidden. Both had learned to be strong in their own ways. Sam in her silence, Ethan in his shadows. The truck's engine growled as Ethan pushed it harder. The dark thoughts kept coming, memories he'd tried to bury in the mountains. Another mission, another acceptable loss. A safe house in Berlin where everything went wrong. A hospital in Cairo that burned because he'd been too focused on the target to see the bigger picture. A marketplace in Bogota where his pursuit of an arms dealer had led to civilian casualties. Each time, his superiors had praised his effectiveness while dismissing the cost. Each time, a piece of his humanity had crumbled away. He'd become what they wanted, a ghost, a weapon, a thing that moved through the shadows and left only silence in its wake. But Sam had never seen him that way. Even after everything, even after all his failures as a brother, she'd seen him as human. Her last note to him, before he disappeared into the mountains, had said, "You're not a ghost. You're just lost. Come find yourself when you're ready." Maybe that's what this was, not just a rescue mission, but a chance at redemption. A chance to use his skills to protect rather than destroy, to save rather than eliminate. The highway sign showed he was getting closer. Another hour, maybe less if he pushed it. In his mind, he began to prepare not just tactically, but emotionally. What would he say to Sam? How could he explain the years of absence, the missed moments, the choices that had led him away from family and into darkness? More memories surfaced as he drove. Sam at her high school graduation, scanning the crowd for a brother who wasn't there. Sam in the hospital after losing her voice, trying to be strong while he made awkward attempts at comfort before fleeing back to his missions. Sam at their parents' graves, standing alone because he hadn't even known they were gone. Each memory was a weight, a burden of guilt he'd carried into the mountains but never managed to leave behind. Now, racing through the night toward whatever danger waited at Jerry's truck stop, he felt the weight shifting. Not lifting, he didn't deserve that yet, but changing from a burden into a purpose. The ghost had been good at eliminating threats, at making problems disappear. But Sam didn't need a ghost. She needed her brother. The question was, after everything, could he be both? The last gas station before the truck stop appeared ahead. Ethan pulled in, knowing he needed to top off the tank. No tactical advantages would be surrendered to empty fuel tanks. As he stood in the harsh fluorescent light, he checked his weapons one final time. Everything was ready. The elderly attendant peered at him through the window, probably wondering what someone like him was doing out here so late. If the man only knew, the ghost, the legendary operative, pumping gas like any ordinary traveler while mentally preparing for what might be the most important mission of his life. Back on the road, Ethan's training kicked in fully. His senses sharpened, taking in every detail of the darkness around him. The weight of the Sig Sauer against his ribs was comforting. The tactical gear waited in the back, ready to transform him from a traveler into something else entirely. Up ahead, the first signs for Jerry's truck stop appeared. 10 miles. The moment of truth was approaching. Would he find Sam in time? Would he be able to protect her? Would she even want his protection after all this time? In the distance, he caught a glimpse of fluorescent lights cutting through the darkness. Jerry's truck stop. From this far out, it looked peaceful enough. Just another oasis of light in the desert of night. But Ethan knew better. Somewhere in those pools of light, Sam was waiting. And somewhere in the darkness, threats were gathering. The truck's engine growled as he took the exit ramp. The ghost was ready for whatever violence the night might bring. But more importantly, Ethan Mitchell was ready to be a brother again, if Sam would let him. The truck stop grew larger in his windshield. A few scattered vehicles in the parking lot, but no motorcycles. Not yet. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the empty pavement. And there, in one of the windows, a silhouette he would know anywhere, Sam, standing watch, waiting. Ethan pulled into the lot, positioning the truck for a quick exit if needed. As he killed the engine, the silence was absolute. The moment stretched, heavy with the weight of years of separation and regret. Then, slowly, deliberately, he stepped out of the truck. The ghost moved through shadows with deadly grace. But it was Ethan Mitchell who walked toward the entrance of Jerry's truck stop, toward whatever reconciliation or damnation awaited him there. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, the sound impossibly loud in the midnight quiet. Sam turned, and their eyes met across the empty diner. In that moment, everything, the missions, the failures, the years of silence, hung between them like smoke. The battle that was coming would test them both. But first, they had to bridge the gap that 3 years of mountain solitude and 5 years of silence had created. The ghost knew how to fight, how to kill, how to disappear, but only Ethan knew how to be a brother. In the distance, the sound of motorcycles shattered the night's silence. The time for reconciliation would have to wait. Now it was time for the ghost to show why that name had once struck fear into the hearts of those who had heard it whispered in the dark. Ethan closed the door behind him, the bell's cheerful chime a stark contrast to the deadly purpose in his movements. Whatever happened next would change everything. For him, for Sam, for everyone involved. The ghost was back, and this time, he was fighting for family. The rumble of motorcycles shattered the midnight silence at Jerry's truck stop, a sound like approaching thunder. Snake's gang rolled into the parking lot in perfect formation, their bikes chrome gleaming under the fluorescent lights. They circled the lot once, twice, a predatory dance that sent shadows spinning across the windows of the diner. Snake led them in a V formation, his custom Harley's pipes screaming as he cut the engine. Behind him, Skull and Hook took the left flank while Diesel, wrench, and razor spread out to the right. The arrangement wasn't random. It was a hunting pattern designed to intimidate and control. Inside the diner, Sam stood behind the counter, her hands steady as she wiped the same spot over and over. Marge huddled near the kitchen entrance, her earlier bravado replaced by naked fear. Joe, who had insisted on returning despite his injuries, sat in a booth near the back, his face still swollen and bruised from the earlier beating. The bikers dismounted in unison, their boots crunching on broken glass from their morning visit. Snake took his time, removing his gloves finger by finger, his eyes never leaving the diner's windows. He knew Sam was watching. That's exactly what he wanted. "Lock it down, boys," Snake called out, his voice carrying across the parking lot. "Nobody leaves until we're done with our conversation." Razor and Wrench moved to the front doors, while Diesel and Hook circled around to cover the back exit. The sound of chains being threaded through door handles echoed in the quiet night. Skull stood by Snake, cracking his knuckles with anticipation. Well, Snake drawled as he pushed through the front door, the bell's cheerful chime incongruous with the menace of his entrance. "Looks like someone's been cleaning up our little mess." How thoughtful. Sam remained behind the counter, her posture straight, her eyes meeting Snake's without flinching. Her notepad hung at her waist, untouched. She had nothing to say to him, even in writing. Still playing the silent game, huh? Snake's boots left dirty tracks across the freshly mopped floor as he approached the counter. "You know, most people would have run by now. But you." He leaned forward, his scarred hand splayed on the counter's surface. "You're either very brave or very stupid." Behind him, his gang spread out through the diner. Razor kicked over a recently righted chair. Wrench ran his knife along the vinyl of a booth seat, leaving a long gash. The destruction was casual, almost lazy. They had all night, after all. "Boss," Skull called out from near the kitchen. "Got the old lady here. And look who else came back for more." He gestured toward Joe, who tried to stand but couldn't quite manage it. Snake's smile widened. "Well, if it isn't our friend from this morning. Didn't learn your lesson the first time, old man?" "Leave them alone." Marge's voice quavered but held firm. "Haven't you done enough damage?" "Damage?" Snake picked up a coffee mug, examined it in the harsh fluorescent light. "Lady, you haven't seen damage yet." The mug shattered against the wall, making Marge jump. "That's damage. This morning? That was just us getting warmed up." Outside, in the shadows between the parked trucks, a figure moved with predatory grace. Ethan had arrived minutes before the gang, giving him time to assess the situation. His train eye took in every detail, the positioning of the bikes, the chains on the doors, the sight lines through the windows. 6 targets, 2 guarding the front, 2 at the back, 2 inside with Sam. Snake was the priority threat, but also the most cautious. He'd have to be dealt with last, after his support was eliminated. Ethan moved like smoke between the vehicles, his black tactical gear making him nearly invisible in the darkness. The first order of business was to ensure the gang couldn't escape when things went bad. He pulled a small tool from his belt, a specialized device that would puncture tires without making a sound. Inside, Snake had moved behind the counter, invading Sam's space. She backed away, maintaining distance, but her eyes never wavered from his. Her defiance seemed to both amuse and irritate him. "You know what I think?" Snake reached out, grabbed her notepad before she could stop him. "I think you need to learn some manners. Some proper respect." He flipped through the pages, reading her earlier notes. "Please. Thank you. Order up." Such polite little notes. Maybe we should write some new ones. Joe tried again to stand, using the table for support. "You're nothing but a coward," he ground out through swollen lips. "Picking on someone who can't even fight back." Snake's attention shifted to Joe, his amusement turning to something darker. "You want to go another round, old-timer? Because I gotta say, you didn't do so well in the first one." Outside, Ethan had finished with the bikes. 8 tires strategically punctured, not all of them, but enough to prevent any quick escapes. Now he moved toward the electrical panel on the side of the building. The ghost had always preferred to work in darkness. Inside the diner, Snake had Sam cornered against the back counter. He held her notepad in one hand while the other gestured expansively. "See, here's what's going to happen. First, we're going to have some fun redecorating this place. Then, once we're done with that, his voice dropped to a whisper. You and me are going for a little ride. Show you what happens to people who don't know their place. Sam's hand found the coffee pot behind her, gripping it tight. If he took one more step, but before she could act, the lights went out. The diner plunged into total darkness, the only illumination coming from the distant highway lights filtering through the windows. What the hell? Snake's voice carried a note of uncertainty for the first time. Diesel, check the breaker. On it, boss. Diesel's heavy boots clomped toward the back door. In the darkness, Sam felt Snake's presence move away from her. She heard him bumping into things, heard his gang's confusion as they tried to orient themselves in the blackness. Outside, Ethan watched Diesel emerge from the back door, flashlight beam bouncing as he moved toward the electrical panel. The ghost waited in perfect stillness as the biker approached, counting steps, timing his breath. Diesel never saw what hit him. One moment he was walking, the next a shadow detached itself from the darkness. A hand clamped over his mouth while an arm locked around his throat in a precisely applied blood choke. 15 seconds later, Diesel was unconscious, zip-tied, and hidden behind a dumpster. Diesel? Hook's voice carried from the back door. You find a problem? When no answer came, Hook drew a pistol and moved cautiously forward. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, searching. He found the open electrical panel, but no sign of Diesel. The ghost moved like liquid shadow, flowing from one patch of darkness to another. Hook's flashlight beam passed within inches of him twice, but never quite found him. When the strike came, it was swift and silent. Hook's gun hand was trapped, twisted, the weapon removed before he could even think of firing. The chokehold followed, and soon Hook joined Diesel in zip-tied unconsciousness. Inside, Snake was trying to maintain control of the deteriorating situation. Razor, wrench, check the front. Skull, get over here. But Skull had problems of his own. In the darkness, he'd lost track of the old lady and the injured man. He could hear movement, but couldn't pin it down. His own flashlight beam jumped nervously from shadow to shadow. Sam remained still behind the counter, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. She could hear Snake moving, could track his position by sound. Her hand found the drawer where they kept the spare flashlights, but she left them there. Darkness was her ally now. Outside, Ethan approached the front of the diner. Razor and Wrench had positioned themselves on either side of the entrance, their own flashlights creating overlapping fields of view. It was a good tactical position, if they'd been dealing with a normal threat. But the ghost was anything but normal. He'd already identified 3 different approach vectors, calculated timing and angles, planned his attack sequence. When he moved, it was with liquid precision. A small object rolled between Razor and Wrench, not a grenade, just a handful of ball bearings. Both men startled at the sound, their flashlight beams converging on the innocent noise. That moment of distraction was all the ghost needed. Wrench went down first, a precision strike to the back of the knee followed by a throat chop that left him gasping silently on the ground. Razor managed to turn, to begin bringing his flashlight around like a club, but he was far too slow. A palm strike to the solar plexus doubled him over, and an elbow to the base of the skull put him down. Inside, Snake was starting to feel the walls close in. Razor? Wrench? Somebody better answer me. Silence was his only reply. Well, silence and the sudden, terrifying awareness that something was very wrong. His remaining flashlight beam seemed weak, inadequate against the pressing darkness. Skull, get your ass over here. Boss. Skull's voice carried an edge of panic. Something's out there. Something's hunting us. A sound from the front of the diner, the rattle of chains being removed from the doors. Snake's beam swung that way, catching a glimpse of movement that vanished before he could focus on it. Skull. Snake's voice had lost its earlier confidence. Get over here now. But Skull never made it. There was a brief scuffle in the darkness, a muffled grunt, and then nothing. Snake's flashlight beam found empty space where his last man had been standing. In the kitchen, Marge huddled with Joe, both of them silent as they listened to the sounds of invisible violence. Sam remained behind the counter, perfectly still, knowing exactly what was happening. It was happening. Snake's breathing had grown rapid, his flashlight beam jerking from shadow to shadow. The ghost let him panic, Let him feel the fear building. Psychological warfare had always been part of the arsenal. Who's out there? Snake's voice cracked slightly. Show yourself. The ghost's voice came from everywhere and nowhere, a whisper in the darkness. You should have left her alone. Snake fired blindly into the shadows, the gunshots deafening in the confined space. Muzzle flashes destroyed his night vision, leaving him more vulnerable than ever. When the echoes died away, the darkness felt even heavier. You don't know who you're dealing with, Snake shouted, trying to sound threatening, but achieving only desperation. I've got connections. People will come looking. Let them come. The voice was behind him now. Snake spun, firing again, but hitting nothing. His flashlight beam showed only empty space, yet he could feel a presence circling him, closing in. What are you? The question escaped Snake's lips before he could stop it. In the darkness, the ghost smiled. I'm her brother. The flashlight slipped from Snake's trembling fingers, plunging the diner into complete darkness. The last thing he saw was a shadow detaching itself from the other shadows, moving toward him with deadly purpose. The ghost had come home, and he had brought the darkness with him. Darkness filled Jerry's truck stop like black water, thick and oppressive. The fluorescent lights that had buzzed overhead for decades were silent now, leaving only slivers of moonlight filtering through the windows. In this darkness, Ethan Mitchell, the operative once known as Ghost, moved like a shadow among shadows. The remaining bikers huddled in small groups, their flashlight beams cutting through the blackness like nervous fingers. They'd already lost Diesel and Hook outside, and Razor and Wrench at the entrance. Now the darkness seemed alive, watching, waiting to claim its next victim. Skull, the heavy-set biker with the distinctive head tattoo, edged along the counter, his leather vest creaking with each cautious step. The beam of his flashlight darted from corner to corner, creating moving shadows that seemed to dance and twist. A coffee cup clinked somewhere in the darkness, just a subtle sound, barely audible. Skull spun toward the noise, his flashlight beam finding nothing but empty space. Then something cold and hard, the business end of a coffee pot, pressed against the back of his neck. Don't, whispered a voice that seemed to come from the darkness itself. Before Skull could react, the coffee pot smashed against his skull, and strong arms guided his unconscious body silently to the floor. The ghost dragged him behind the counter, securing him with zip ties before melting back into the shadows. Skull. Snake's voice carried an edge of panic now. Report in. Where the hell are you? Silence answered him. The remaining bikers, Hammer and Chain, pressed their backs against the wall, their own flashlights creating overlapping beams of false security. Spread out, Snake ordered, trying to maintain control of the situation. Find this bastard. Boss, Hammer's voice shook slightly. Maybe we should. Spread out. Snake's voice was steel. Now, in the darkness, Ethan allowed himself a grim smile. Fear was spreading through the gang like a virus, exactly as he'd planned. In the pitch black of the diner, every shadow could hide death. Every sound could be the last thing they heard. Meanwhile, Sam moved silently through the familiar space of her diner, using the darkness as skillfully as her brother. She knew every inch of this place, every creaky floorboard, every counter edge. She found Marge and Joe huddled in a corner booth and touched their shoulders gently to avoid startling them. Her notepad appeared in the dim light, her pen scratching quickly. Stay down. Ethan's here. He'll handle this. Marge's eyes widened in recognition. She'd heard Sam mention her brother only once in passing, but the way she'd said his name had told volumes. Joe, his face still swollen from the morning's beating, merely nodded. They both pressed lower in their booth as Sam moved away. Across the diner, Hammer's flashlight beam caught movement. He squeezed off 2 shots, the muzzle flashes temporarily blinding him. When his vision cleared, he saw what he'd been shooting at, a dish towel falling from where it had been thrown. The distraction was all Ethan needed. He came in low and fast, using a broken chair leg as a makeshift tonfa. The first strike took out Hammer's knee with a sickening crack. The second caught him under the chin as he fell, sending him into unconsciousness before he hit the floor. But the encounter wasn't without cost. As Hammer fell, his flailing arm caught Ethan's side, sending a spike of pain through his ribs. The ghost pushed the pain aside. He'd worked through worse, but noted the injury for later. No tactical advantage could be surrendered to disability. Chain's voice came from near the kitchen, high and stressed. "Hammer? You okay, man?" When no answer came, the biker's breathing became ragged. "Boss, this is screwed up. This is all kinds of screwed up." "Shut up," Snake snarled, but his own voice betrayed his growing fear. Just shut up and keep looking." Ethan moved through the darkness again, selecting his next weapon. His hand found a heavy ceramic plate, cracked but still solid. In the right hands, anything could become lethal. The ghost had once killed a man in Bangkok with nothing but a pencil and a rubber band. Chain had backed himself into the kitchen area, using the serving window as cover while he swept his flashlight beam back and forth. Smart, but not smart enough. The beam caught something metallic, a knife from the cutting board, falling to the floor with a clatter. Chain's attention snapped to the sound, just as Ethan had intended. The ghost came from the other direction, vaulting through the serving window with fluid grace. The plate connected with Chain's temple before he could turn, sending him sprawling across the industrial tile floor. But Chain wasn't finished. As he fell, he managed to grab Ethan's ankle, yanking hard. The ghost went down, his shoulder slamming into the edge of the stainless steel prep table. Pain flared, bright and immediate, but training took over. Ethan rolled with the fall, came up with a kitchen knife in hand, and ended the fight with a precise strike to Chain's solar plexus with the knife's handle. As Chain's unconscious body slumped to the floor, Ethan pressed a hand to his throbbing shoulder. The injury wasn't serious, but it would limit his mobility slightly. He needed to end this soon. Out in the dining room, Snake was coming apart at the seams. His earlier bravado had evaporated in the darkness, replaced by jumping at shadows and wild shots at imagined movement. His flashlight beam trembled as it swept the room. "Come out," he shouted, voice cracking. "Face me like a man." Sam, still moving silently through her domain, spotted Marge trying to help Joe toward the back exit. She quickly wrote another note, pressing it into Marge's hand. "Not yet. Wait for my signal. Ethan needs to finish this." Marge nodded, helping Joe back into cover. The old mechanic's breathing was labored, but his eyes were clear as he watched the drama unfolding in the darkness. This wasn't the justice he'd imagined for Snake, but he had to admit it was fitting. The ghost retrieved another weapon from the kitchen, a heavy cast iron skillet that felt right in his hands. He moved back into the dining room, circling Snake's position. The biker leader was dangerous now, like any cornered animal. His gun still had rounds, and fear made men unpredictable. "You think this changes anything?" Snake's voice rose, becoming manic. "You think taking out my boys means it's over? I've got connections. I've got people who'll burn this place to the ground, who'll hunt down everyone inside it." The ghost's voice came from everywhere and nowhere. "No one's hunting anyone after tonight." Snake fired wildly at the sound, the muzzle flash momentarily illuminating his terror-stricken face. The bullet embedded itself in the wall, well wide of where Ethan actually was. 2 shots left, by the ghost's count. Another sound drew Snake's attention, the subtle scrape of a boot on linoleum. He spun, fired again. 1 shot left. His flashlight beam showed nothing but overturned tables and broken glass. "What are you?" Snake's voice was barely a whisper now. "I'm what happens," the ghost replied from the darkness, "when you hurt my family." The skillet whistled through the air, caught Snake's gun hand with devastating force. The weapon clattered to the floor as the biker leader howled in pain, cradling his shattered fingers. But Snake wasn't done. With his good hand, he grabbed a broken bottle from a nearby table, swinging it in a wild arc. The ghost faded back, letting the attack miss by inches. Snake followed up with a rush, trying to use his superior size to his advantage. It was exactly what Ethan had been waiting for. He redirected Snake's momentum, adding a subtle trip that sent the biker leader crashing into the counter. Before Snake could recover, the ghost had him in a joint lock that threatened to dislocate his shoulder. "It's over," Ethan said quietly. "Like hell it is," Snake spat, though the pain in his voice betrayed his bravado. "You have no idea what you've started." The pressure on his shoulder increased slightly. "No," the ghost corrected him. "You have no idea what you started when you walked into my sister's diner." Understanding dawned in Snake's voice. The mute girl? She's your... The joint lock tightened further, drawing a gasp of pain. Choose your next words very carefully. In the darkness, Sam moved to the circuit breaker panel. Her hand found the main switch, and light flooded back into the diner. The sudden brightness revealed the full tableau. Snake held immobile by a man in tactical gear, the unconscious bodies of his gang scattered throughout the diner, and Sam standing tall behind the counter. Take a good look, Ethan said, his voice cold. That's my sister. The woman you threatened. The one you thought was weak because she couldn't speak. The pressure increased again. I want you to remember this moment. Remember what happened when you mistook silence for weakness. Snake's eyes darted around the diner, taking in the efficient brutality that had dismantled his gang. Oh, what are you? He's the ghost, Sam wrote on her notepad, holding it up for Snake to see. The simple words carried the weight of legend, of whispered stories about an operative who could make entire organizations disappear without a trace. Fear, real fear, not the panic of the hunt, but the bone-deep terror of someone who suddenly realized how far over their head they were, filled Snake's face. Listen, he began, his voice quavering. We can work something out. I've got money, connections. You've got nothing. Ethan cut him off. In fact, after tonight, you won't even have your reputation. Because if you ever come near my sister again, if you ever even think about this place, or the people in it, the ghost's voice dropped to a whisper. I'll show you why they gave me that name. With a precise application of pressure, Ethan sent Snake into unconsciousness. The biker leader slumped to the floor, joining his gang in defeat. The ghost zip-tied him efficiently, then stood to survey the scene. Sam approached slowly, her notepad ready. But instead of writing, she simply reached out and touched Ethan's injured shoulder gently. Her eyes asked the question her voice couldn't. I'm fine, he assured her. Nothing serious. Marge and Joe emerged from their hiding spot, staring at the scene with a mixture of awe and residual fear. The diner looked like a war zone. Overturned furniture, broken glass, unconscious bikers scattered about. I'll call the sheriff, Marge said, her voice still shaky. And an ambulance for Joe. Ethan nodded. They'll find enough evidence in their saddlebags to put them away for a long time. Drugs, weapons, proof of other crimes. He turned to Sam. You won't have to worry about them again. Sam wrote quickly. You're hurt. Let me look at that shoulder. Sam, he began, but she was already pushing him toward a chair, her expression brooking no argument. Some things, it seemed, hadn't changed. Little sisters could be just as bossy without a voice. As she examined his injuries with gentle hands, Ethan found himself really looking at her for the first time in years. She'd grown stronger, more confident, even in her silence. Or perhaps because of it, she'd built a life here, created a family of sorts with people like Marge and Joe. I'm sorry, he said quietly, for not being here when you needed me, for running away instead of facing what happened. Sam paused in her examination, then wrote, You're here now. That's what matters. In the distance, sirens began to wail, law enforcement finally responding to the night's events. There would be questions, reports to file, statements to make. But for now, in the fluorescent-lit aftermath of violence, brother and sister had found their way back to each other. The ghost had completed his mission, but Ethan Mitchell had accomplished something far more important. He'd found his way home. The fluorescent lights of Jerry's truck stop hummed back to life, revealing a scene of controlled chaos. Snake's gang lay scattered throughout the diner, each man efficiently subdued and zip-tied. Glass and broken furniture created an obstacle course across the linoleum floor, and the acrid smell of gunpowder hung in the air from Snake's wild shots. In the center of it all stood Ethan Mitchell, his tactical gear making him look like a piece of living darkness even in the harsh light. His movements were fluid despite his injured shoulder, each step calculated and precise as he approached Snake, who had managed to regain consciousness and was struggling to his feet. Stay where you are. Ethan's voice carried the quiet authority of someone used to being obeyed. When Snake continued to rise, Ethan simply watched, letting him make the choice that would determine how this ended. Snake straightened to his full height, his earlier fear giving way to desperate bravado. Blood trickled from a cut above his eye, and his right hand hung useless at his side, fingers swollen from their encounter, with the cast iron skillet. "You have no idea what you've done," Snake snarled, trying to sound threatening despite his obvious disadvantage. "I've got people in every state from here to California. One phone call, that's all it takes. They'll come looking for payback." Ethan's laugh was soft and entirely without humor. "You really don't know who I am, do you?" He moved closer, his boots crunching on broken glass. "Those connections you're so proud of? The ones you think make you untouchable?" He shook his head slowly. "I've eliminated entire organizations more powerful than your little network of thugs." "You're bluffing," Snake said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Nobody's that connected. Tell me," Ethan's voice dropped lower, becoming almost conversational. "Have you heard of the ghost?" The change in Snake's expression was immediate and profound. The color drained from his face as the name registered. That's just a story. Something people made up to scare each other. 3 years ago, a cartel safe house in Mexico City burned to the ground. Everyone inside disappeared without a trace. Ethan took another step forward. Last year, a human trafficking ring in Eastern Europe simply ceased to exist overnight. All their key players vanished. Another step. 6 months ago, a corrupt police chief in Bangkok was found tied up in his own evidence locker, surrounded by proof of every crime he'd ever committed or covered up. Each example seemed to make Snake shrink slightly, the realization of exactly what kind of predator he'd attracted settling in. "Listen," he began, his voice taking on a pleading edge, "this was all just business. Nothing personal. We can work something out. Nothing personal." Ethan's voice carried a dangerous edge now. "You beat an old man half to death, terrorized innocent people, threatened my sister." His eyes, when they met Snake's, were devoid of emotion. "It became personal the moment you walked through that door." Snake's hand moved suddenly, drawing a hidden knife from his boot. The blade flashed in the fluorescent light as he slashed wildly at Ethan's face. But the ghost was already moving, flowing around the attack like water around a rock. His hand caught Snake's wrist, twisted sharply, and the knife clattered to the floor. "You don't want to do this," Ethan said softly, still holding Snake's wrist at a painful angle. "You really don't." But Snake was beyond reason now, operating on pure desperation. He drove his knee up toward Ethan's groin, simultaneously trying to headbutt him. The ghost shifted slightly, letting the knee strike glance off his thigh, while avoiding the headbutt entirely. Then he moved. The counterattack was brutally efficient. An elbow strike to Snake's solar plexus drove the air from his lungs. A sweep took his legs out from under him, and he hit the floor hard enough to rattle the windows. Before he could recover, Ethan had him in a joint lock that threatened to dislocate both his shoulder and his elbow. "Wait," Snake gasped out. "Wait, I've got money. Lots of it. Hidden away where the cops won't find it. It's yours. Just let me walk away. I'll disappear. Never come back. You'll never hear from me again." Ethan maintained the pressure on Snake's joints as he spoke. "You know what I've been thinking about? That old man you had your gang beat up, Joe. Vietnam vet, retired mechanic. Spent 40 years building an honest life, helping people in this community. And you had him beaten because he dared to stand up to you? I'm sorry." Snake's voice was high with pain and fear. "I wasn't thinking straight. Then there's Marge." Ethan continued as if Snake hadn't spoken. "Worked this diner for 20 years. Helped Sam adjust when she lost her voice. Another innocent person you terrorized for your own amusement." The pressure increased slightly, drawing a whimper from Snake. "Please, I'll make it right. However you want." "And Sam?" Ethan's voice became very quiet. "My sister, who lost her voice in an accident and built a new life for herself. Who faces every day with more courage than you've shown in your entire miserable existence. You thought her silence made her weak. Thought it made her an easy target." From her position behind the counter, Sam watched the confrontation with growing concern. She could see the struggle in her brother's eyes. Not physical, but moral. The ghost wanted to end this permanently, to ensure Snake could never threaten anyone again. But Ethan, the brother who had taught her about right and wrong all those years ago, was fighting that impulse. Snake must have sensed the internal conflict as well. "I've got a daughter," he said quickly. 7 years old. She needs her father. Please." For a moment, everything went still. Sam could see Ethan's grip tighten, could read in his posture what he was considering. The ghost had killed for less than what Snake had done today, had eliminated threats with far more justification than this. Then Snake made his final mistake. With his free hand, he managed to grab a shard of broken mirror from the floor. The makeshift weapon slashed up toward Ethan's face, forcing him to release the joint lock and step back. What followed was brutal and decisive. Snake lunged forward, trying to press his momentary advantage, but Ethan met him with controlled violence. A precise strike to Snake's knee sent him stumbling. An elbow to the jaw snapped his head back. A knee to the solar plexus doubled him over. Snake tried to fight back, throwing wild punches that Ethan slipped or blocked with almost casual ease. Each of the ghost's counterstrikes was calculated for maximum effect with minimum energy expenditure. It wasn't a fight so much as a systematic dismantling. Finally, Snake went down hard, blood flowing freely from his nose and split lip. Ethan stood over him, perfectly positioned to deliver a killing blow. The ghost training screamed at him to eliminate the threat permanently, to ensure there could be no future reprisals. Sam moved then, stepping out from behind the counter. Her footsteps were silent on the glass-strewn floor as she approached. When Ethan turned to look at her, she shook her head slowly, then wrote on her notepad, "Not like this. We're better than him." The tension in Ethan's shoulders eased slightly as he read her words. She was right, of course. The ghost might solve problems with permanent solutions, but Ethan Mitchell had promised to be a brother again. That meant choosing a different path. "You're lucky," he told Snake, who lay groaning on the floor. "My sister believes in justice more than vengeance." He knelt down beside the fallen biker leader. "So here's what's going to happen. The police are on their way. They're going to find enough evidence in your saddlebags to put you away for a very long time. Drug trafficking, illegal weapons, assault, the list goes on." Snake tried to speak, but Ethan cut him off. "I'm not finished. While you're in prison, I'm going to be watching. If anything happens to Sam, to this diner, to anyone here, if so much as a parking ticket gets written because of your connections, I'll know." And then he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Then I won't listen to my sister's mercy. Understand?" The fight had gone out of Snake completely now. He nodded weakly, finally understanding the full gravity of his situation. Ethan zip-tied his hands efficiently, then pulled him into a sitting position against the counter. Sam wrote something else on her notepad and showed it to Snake. "The police will be interested in what happened to Claire Thompson's family." Snake's eyes widened in recognition of the name. Sam continued writing. "They disappeared 3 months ago after her husband reported drug activity at another truck stop. The one you and your gang used to frequent." Ethan raised an eyebrow at this information. "See? My sister might be silent, but she notices everything. Keeps track of patterns, connects dots. She's probably got enough information to help the police solve a dozen cases." He smiled coldly. "And you thought she was an easy target?" In the distance, sirens were growing louder. Snake slumped in defeat, knowing his reign of terror was truly over. His gang was finished, his reputation destroyed, and his freedom about to be forfeit to the justice system. Sam touched Ethan's arm gently, then wrote, "You should go. Too many questions if you're here when they arrive." Ethan nodded, understanding the wisdom of this. The ghost couldn't afford to be connected to tonight's events, no matter how justified they were. But before he moved toward the back exit, he had one last thing to say to Snake. "Remember this night," he said softly. "Remember what happened when you mistook silence for weakness. Remember that somewhere out there the ghost is watching. And if you ever come near my sister again..." He left the threat unfinished, letting Snake's imagination fill in the consequences. Sam walked with Ethan to the back door, her notepad already moving. "Will you disappear again?" Ethan looked at his sister, really looked at her, seeing not just the strength she developed, but also the lingering pain of his previous abandonments. "No," he said firmly. "I'm done running. I'll find a way to be here for you, while keeping my distance from..." He gestured at the aftermath of violence in the diner. "All this..." Sam's smile was bright, even in the dim light of the back hallway. She wrote quickly, "Good. Because I expect you at Sunday dinner from now on. Marge makes amazing pot roast." A real smile, perhaps the first one in years, crossed Ethan's face. "Wouldn't miss it." He hugged her quickly, then slipped out into the night, just as the first police cars pulled into the parking lot, their lights painting the scene in alternating red and blue. Sam returned to the diner's main room, where Snake sat in his zip-tied defeat while his unconscious gang members lay scattered about like broken dolls. The police would have questions, of course, but the evidence they'd find would tell most of the story. The rest could be explained through her notepad and the testimonies of Marge and Joe. As she watched the first officers enter with drawn weapons, Sam felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The silence that Snake had mocked, that so many had seen as a weakness, had proven to be a strength. It had taught her to observe, to plan, to be patient. And when the moment came, it had helped her save not just herself, but her brother too, saving him from crossing a line that would have darkened his soul even further. The ghost had come home tonight, but more importantly, so had her brother. And in the end, that was worth more than any victory over men like Snake. Justice would be served through the legal system, and healing could begin, not just for the diner and its people, but for the broken relationship between a sister who had lost her voice and a brother who had lost his way. The night's violence was over, replaced by the methodical process of law enforcement. But somewhere in the darkness, a brother kept watch, ensuring that his sister's silent strength would never be tested this way again. The first hints of dawn were starting to lighten the sky as Ethan made his way back to Marge and Joe's hiding place in the diner's storage room. The sounds of approaching sirens grew louder, but there was still time to ensure everyone was properly taken care of before the authorities arrived. "It's over," he said softly, helping Joe to his feet. The old mechanic winced but managed to stand, leaning heavily on Ethan's arm. Despite his earlier injuries from the morning's beating, Joe had refused to leave when things got bad, showing the same courage that had made him stand up to Snake in the first place. Marge emerged from behind a stack of boxes, her usually immaculate uniform stained and crumpled, but her spirit unbroken. "Those boys," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Are they?" "Alive," Ethan assured her. "Just unconscious and zip-tied. The police will find them exactly as they deserve to be found." Together, they made their way back to the main dining room. The scene that greeted them was one of controlled chaos. Overturned furniture, broken glass, and the unconscious forms of Snake's gang scattered about like discarded toys. But amid the destruction, Sam stood tall behind her counter, already starting to straighten what could be straightened. When she saw them emerge, Sam immediately grabbed her notepad and began writing. Her hands were steady despite everything that had happened, her movements precise as she held up the note for Ethan to read. "Thank you. Not just for tonight, but for coming back at all. I wasn't sure you would." Ethan helped Joe into a booth before responding. "I should have come back years ago. After the accident. After our parents." He ran a hand through his short hair, guilt evident in every line of his face. "I told myself I was protecting you by staying away, that my work would put you in danger. But the truth is I was a coward. It was easier to be the ghost than to be your brother." Sam wrote quickly. "You were lost, but you found your way back. That's what matters." Before Ethan could respond, the first police cruiser pulled into the parking lot, its lights painting the interior of the diner in alternating red and blue. Through the windows, they could see Sheriff Daniel Matthews stepping out, his hand resting cautiously on his holstered weapon as he surveyed the scene. "Sam," Ethan said quietly, "you should go meet him. It'll look better coming from you." She nodded, already writing a new note to show the sheriff. As she walked to the door, Ethan helped Marge begin gathering broken glass from the floor. They could hear the sheriff's voice outside, professional but tinged with concern as Sam showed him her written account of events. More police cars arrived, along with an ambulance for Joe. The EMTs worked efficiently, checking his injuries and preparing him for transport. Through it all, Sheriff Matthews conducted his investigation with thorough professionalism, though his eyes kept darting to the efficiently restrained bikers with something like grudging admiration. Finally, the sheriff approached Ethan, who was helping Marge right an overturned table. "You must be Sam's brother," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "The one she mentioned in her statement." "Yes, sir," Ethan replied simply. The sheriff nodded slowly, his eyes taking in details that most people would miss. The way Ethan moved, the precision of his actions, the subtle signs of his training. "Interesting timing, you showing up tonight. Almost like someone called you." "Sam needed help," Ethan said. "That's all that matters. Funny thing, Matthews continued, his voice dropping slightly. About 5 years ago, I had some training with an interagency task force. They told stories about an operative they called a ghost. Someone who could appear and disappear at will, leaving nothing but unconscious bodies and zip-tied suspects in his wake. Ethan met his gaze steadily, but said nothing. The thing is, the sheriff went on, those stories always ended the same way, with the bad guys in custody and enough evidence gathered to make charges stick. Clean. Professional. Almost like tonight. Sounds like quite a story, Ethan replied carefully. Matthews smiled slightly. Yes, it does. He glanced around the diner, taking in the scene one more time. Well, I think we have everything we need here. Snake and his gang will be facing quite a few charges, especially once we process the contents of their saddlebags. And it seems Ms. Thompson's missing family case might finally get some movement. As if on cue, one of the deputies called out, Sheriff, you need to see what we found in their bikes. If you'll excuse me, Matthews said, then added quietly, it's good that Sam has someone looking out for her. Family's important. As the sheriff walked away, more vehicles began arriving. Not police this time, but regular customers and locals. Word had spread fast about what had happened at Jerry's truck stop, and the community was responding in force. Mike, the trucker who'd been a regular for years, pulled up in his rig. Sam, he called out, hurrying inside. I've got my tools in the truck. Just tell me what needs fixing first. Old Pete arrived with his pickup full of lumber and cleaning supplies. The boys at the hardware store are opening early, he announced. They're sending everything we need at cost. More people kept coming. Farmers, mechanics, other truckers, all bringing what they could to help. Sarah from the local diner brought coffee and breakfast for everyone. Tom Bradley, the retired carpenter, was already measuring the broken door frame and making a list of materials needed. Sam stood in the midst of this outpouring of support, her eyes bright with unshed tears as she wrote note after note of thanks. These people, who had seemed to accept her silence so easily over the years, were now showing just how deeply they cared about her and her diner. Marge watched it all with a proud smile. See, she said to no one in particular. This is what community really means. Not thugs with motorcycles, but people coming together when one of their own needs help. As the sun rose higher, the diner began to transform. Broken glass was swept away, tables and chairs were righted or replaced, and the first fresh cup of coffee was brewed in a new machine someone had brought from town. The destruction that Snake and his gang had wrought was being erased by dozens of willing hands. Sam found Ethan in the back office, where he was gathering his tactical gear. Her notepad appeared. You don't have to go. Yes, I do, he said gently. The ghost can't stay in one place too long. It's not safe. For me or for you. She wrote again. But you'll come back? Every Sunday, he promised. And any other time you need me. Just because I can't stay doesn't mean I'm leaving you again. He pulled a small device from his pocket. A new satellite phone, sleeker than the old one. This one's better encrypted. You can reach me anytime, not just for emergencies. Sam took the phone, then wrote, I'm proud of you, you know. Not for the fighting, but for choosing not to kill Snake. For remembering who you really are. Ethan smiled slightly. I had a good reminder. He gestured toward the dining room, where the sounds of reconstruction continued. You built something real here, Sam. Something worth protecting the right way. She wrote quickly. We both found our way home, just differently. Yeah, he agreed softly. I guess we did. The siblings shared a long look, years of pain and separation beginning to heal in the morning light. Then Sam wrote one more note. Sunday dinner. Don't be late. Marge really does make amazing pot roast. I'll be there, Ethan promised. He shouldered his bag, then hesitated. Sam, I'm sorry it took something like this to bring me back. I should have been here all along. She shook her head and wrote, The past is past. We build from here. Outside, the sounds of reconstruction had taken on a rhythm. Hammers pounding, power tools whirring, voices calling out measurements and requests for materials. The destruction of the night was being erased by the determination of the day. Ethan slipped out the back door as Sam returned to the dining room. Through the window, he watched her move among her community, her notepad constantly in motion as she directed repairs, accepted help, and continued to be the heart of Jerry's truck stop. The ghost had come home last night, emerging from the shadows to protect what mattered. But in the morning light, it was Ethan Mitchell who drove away from the truck stop, carrying not just the promise of return, but the weight of redemption. In his rearview mirror, he could see the gathering of people around the diner growing larger. A delivery truck from the local lumber yard was pulling in, and more vehicles were arriving with supplies and willing hands. The sun caught on the chrome of Mike's big rig, on the tools being passed from person to person, on the new glass being carefully fitted into broken windows. The diner would be whole again by nightfall, he knew. Not just physically repaired, but strengthened by the knowledge that it was protected, by a community that cared, by a silent woman whose courage had never wavered, and by a brother who had finally found his way back from the shadows. As Ethan turned onto the highway, his phone buzzed. A text from Sam, "Drive safe. See you Sunday." He smiled, typed back a quick acknowledgement, and pointed his truck toward the mountains. He had preparations to make, a safer location to establish, one closer to the truck stop, and a new life to build that could balance the ghost's necessary distance with a brother's promised presence. Behind him, Jerry's truck stop was coming back to life. The coffee was brewing, the grill was heating up, and Sam's notepad was filling with new orders as the workers took breaks from their repairs. Life was returning to normal, but it was a new normal, one where silence didn't mean weakness, where community meant more than words could say, and where a sister's faith had helped a brother find his way home. The rising sun caught the truck stop sign, making it glow like a beacon. In a few days, all signs of Snake's violence would be erased, replaced by fresh paint and new fixtures. But something permanent had changed, not just in the physical space, but in the people who occupied it. Sam stood in the doorway, watching her brother's truck disappear into the distance. Her notepad held one last unshared message. "Thank you for showing me that sometimes the strongest bonds don't need words at all." The rebuilding continued around her. Each hammer strike and power tool were a testament to resilience. Each helping hand a reminder that true strength often comes not in moments of violence, but in the quiet aftermath when community and family prove stronger than any force that would tear them apart. And somewhere on the mountain roads, a man who had been both ghost and brother drove toward a future where he might finally be able to be both, protector and family, shadow and light, always watching, but no longer hiding from the connections that made life worth protecting in the first place. The story of Jerry's truck stop wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning, but now it would be a story of healing rather than harm, of community rather than isolation, of a sister's silent strength and a brother's returned devotion. The night had brought violence and fear, but the morning had delivered something far more powerful: hope, renewal, and the unshakable knowledge that sometimes the strongest voices are the ones that never need to speak at all. The county jail wasn't much to look at, just a squat concrete building with narrow windows and razor wire. But Snake had been in enough facilities to know that every prison, no matter how secure, had its weaknesses. In this case, that weakness was a corrections officer named Trevor Barnes, whose gambling debts made him susceptible to certain pressures. "Just get the message out," Snake told Barnes during lunch duty, slipping him a carefully folded note. "The numbers memorized?" Barnes nodded nervously, his eyes darting around the cafeteria. "Yeah, but this is going to cost you extra. After what happened to your gang, you'll get what's coming to you." Snake cut him off. "Just make the call." The message was simple, coded in a way that would seem innocent to anyone monitoring prison communications. Family reunion needed. Uncle Jack's kids from Dakota should visit. Bring the whole crew. Party at the old truck stop. To most ears, it would sound like nothing. But to Jack, the butcher Martinez, and his crew of hardened criminals, it was a call to arms. Snake allowed himself a small smile as Barnes hurried away with the note. Soon, Sam and her brother would learn that crossing him had consequences. Meanwhile, 200 miles away, Ethan sat in his new observation post overlooking Jerry's truck stop. He'd relocated closer after the incident, setting up in an abandoned fire tower that gave him clear sight lines of the entire area. His surveillance equipment, far more sophisticated than anything the local law enforcement had access to, monitored all communications in a 50-mile radius. When Snake's coded message was transmitted, Ethan was ready. The encryption was amateur by his standards, and the meaning was clear. He knew Jack Martinez by reputation, a former Special Forces operator turned criminal, leading a crew that made Snake's gang look like Boy Scouts. Sam, he spoke into his satellite phone, the text-to-speech program converting his words into the mechanical voice his sister had grown used to. "We have a situation developing." Snake's called in some heavy hitters. Sam's response came quickly via text. "How bad?" "Bad enough that I'm sending you some supplies." Martinez's crew is professional, military training, tactical experience. They won't make the same mistake Snake did. Over the next few days, unmarked packages began arriving at the diner. Each contained carefully selected items, defensive tools, surveillance equipment, and detailed instructions on their use. Sam found herself studying late into the night, learning about pressure points, joint locks, and the strategic placement of improvised weapons. Ethan's voice came through the phone each evening, guiding her through exercises and scenarios. "Remember," the mechanical voice instructed, "your silence is an advantage. They'll underestimate you, just like Snake did. Use that." Sam took to the training with unexpected enthusiasm. Years of working in the diner had given her an intimate knowledge of the space. Every corner, every possible entry point, every item that could be used in defense. She began making subtle modifications. Strategic mirrors for better sight lines, pressure plates under certain floorboards that would signal movement, carefully positioned objects that could become weapons if needed. The regular customers noticed the changes in Sam too. She moved differently now, more aware, more confident. When she demonstrated one of her new skills by disarming Marge's grandson during a playful moment, the old cook couldn't help but smile. "Girl's finally letting her inner warrior out," she commented to Joe, who was back on his regular schedule despite still healing injuries. 2 weeks after Snake's message, Ethan's surveillance picked up movement. A convoy of motorcycles was heading toward the truck stop. Not the choppers Snake's gang had favored, but sleek, powerful machines built for speed and maneuverability. At their head rode Jack Martinez, his military bearing evident even from a distance. "They're coming," Ethan's mechanical voice warned Sam. 6 riders, heavily armed. Martinez is ex-Delta Force. Don't underestimate them. Sam's response was typical in its brevity. "Ready?" The sun was setting when Martinez's crew pulled into the truck stop's parking lot. Unlike Snake's dramatic entrance, they approached with military precision, bikes positioned for quick escape, riders spreading out to cover all exits. Their leather jackets couldn't quite hide the tactical gear underneath. Sam watched through her newly installed security cameras as Martinez entered alone, his movements controlled and purposeful. He was older than Snake, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of face that had seen too much combat to show emotion easily. "Evening," he said quietly, sliding onto a stool at the counter. "Coffee, black." Sam nodded, moving to pour his cup. Her notepad was ready with its practiced message. "Sorry, can't speak." "We'll write orders." Martinez's eyes took in everything. The subtle changes to the diner's layout, the new mirrors, the way Sam carried herself. "You know why we're here," he said, his voice remaining conversational. "Snake's an associate. What happened to him and his crew? It requires a response." Sam wrote quickly, "Your choice. Leave now, no one gets hurt." A ghost of a smile crossed Martinez's weathered face. "Brave. I can respect that." He took a sip of coffee. "But this isn't about bravery. It's about maintaining order. When someone disrupts our business, there have to be consequences." As if on cue, his crew began filing in, moving with the coordinated precision of men used to working together in combat situations. The few customers present sensed the danger and quickly paid their bills, hurrying out to their vehicles. Sam touched the hidden button under the counter, a signal to Ethan that things were escalating. Then she wrote, "Last chance." Martinez shook his head almost sadly. "No, girl. Your last chance was letting Snake walk away the first time." He stood slowly. "Secure the building." His men moved with professional efficiency, checking corners and sight lines. But Sam was ready. As the first man passed the new coffee station, his boot caught a nearly invisible wire. Scalding coffee burst from the industrial brewer, catching him full in the face. His scream was cut short as Sam vaulted the counter, using one of Ethan's taught moves to take him down hard. The other riders reacted instantly, drawing weapons, but Sam was already moving. The lights went out, not from a cut power line this time, but from strategically placed switches she could trigger remotely. In the sudden darkness, The mirror she'd positioned began reflecting emergency lights in carefully calculated patterns, disorienting anyone not prepared for them. Professional, Martinez commented, genuine admiration in his voice. But not good enough. His men regrouped quickly, adapting to the conditions. They were professionals after all. But Sam had more surprises ready. The pressure plates she'd installed began triggering small explosions of flour from the kitchen, filling the air with white powder that stuck to tactical goggles and obscured vision. Through it all, Sam moved like a ghost herself, using the skills Ethan had taught her. A biker went down to a precisely aimed coffee pot to the temple. Another found himself tangled in a modified wire basket rack that Sam had prepared specifically for this purpose. But Martinez's men were adapting. Two of them had her cornered near the kitchen, their movements coordinated to cut off escape routes. That's when the front window shattered, and Ethan finally announced his presence. The ghost moved through the chaos like a force of nature, his actions economical and devastating. The first biker went down to a throat strike before he could even turn. The second managed to get off a shot that went wide before Ethan disarmed him with a move that Sam recognized from her training. Sam took advantage of the distraction to launch her own attack, using a rolling pin as an improvised weapon. The biker never saw it coming, too focused on the legendary ghost to consider the mute waitress a threat. His knees buckled as the hardwood connected precisely with a nerve cluster Ethan had taught her about. Martinez proved why he was the leader, though. His combat experience showed as he engaged Ethan directly, their fight a deadly dance of military hand-to-hand techniques. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd turned his back on Sam. She moved silently, years of serving customers without making a sound becoming an unexpected combat advantage. The modified pepper shaker she'd prepared, loaded with a mixture Ethan had taught her to make, caught Martinez directly in the face as he grappled with her brother. The former Delta Force operator staggered, his trained reflexes betrayed by burning eyes and lungs. Ethan capitalized immediately, a precise strike dropping Martinez to his knees. Sam followed up with a textbook joint lock, one she'd practiced countless times over the past 2 weeks. "Well done, sis," Ethan said, his voice carrying genuine pride. Martinez, despite his situation, managed a pained laugh. "Should have known," he gasped out. "Snake said it was just a mute waitress and her brother. Didn't mention the brother was the ghost." He coughed, the pepper mixture still affecting him. Or that the waitress was just as dangerous. Sam produced her notepad. "We warned you." "That you did." Martinez tried to blink his streaming eyes clear. "Look, this was business. But clearly, the cost just got too high. I'll make sure everyone knows this place is off limits. Not worth tangling with the ghost. Or his sister." Ethan considered for a moment, then nodded. "Make sure they understand. All of them. Next time won't be this gentle." "Trust me," Martinez said with feeling. "There won't be a next time." He looked at Sam with newfound respect. "Snake's an idiot. Mistook silence for weakness. Won't make that mistake again." As Ethan secured Martinez's crew with zip ties, Sam began writing a longer note. "Tell Snake something for me. Tell him I don't need a voice to be heard. And I don't need to speak to be strong." Martinez read the note and nodded slowly. Message received. Loud and clear. After the police had come and gone, taking statements and collecting Martinez's crew, Sam and Ethan stood in the once again damaged diner. But this time, the damage was minimal, calculated rather than wanton, strategic rather than destructive. "You've learned well," Ethan said, surveying the scene. "That move with the coffee pot? Perfect execution." Sam wrote quickly, "Had a good teacher. Both before and after you gave me the tools." Ethan raised an eyebrow, questioningly. She wrote again, "Silence taught me to observe, to plan, to be patient. You just helped me put those skills to use." The siblings shared a moment of understanding. Then Sam wrote something else. "Think they'll try again?" "No," Ethan said confidently. "Martinez is old school. His word is good. And once word gets out about what happened here," he gestured at the evidence of their coordinated defense. "Well, let's just say your reputation might end up rivaling the ghost's." Sam smiled and wrote, "Speaking of reputations, you're still coming to Sunday dinner, right? Marge is making her famous pie." Ethan laughed. A real laugh, something that had been rare in his years as the ghost. "Wouldn't miss it. Though maybe we should practice some more defensive techniques first." Just in case. Sam's response was quick, already planning some modifications to the napkin dispensers. As they began cleaning up, the first light of dawn started to filter through the windows. The diner would need some repairs, but nothing like the destruction Snake's gang had caused. More importantly, something fundamental had changed. The truck stop was no longer just Sam's refuge. It was now a fortress, protected not just by the ghost shadow, but by the silent strength of a waitress who had learned to turn her perceived weakness into power. The security cameras Ethan had installed caught the first regular customers pulling into the lot, ready for their morning coffee. Sam wrote one last note before heading to start the coffee maker. Time to get back to work. Some things don't change. Ethan watched his sister move through her domain with newfound confidence, knowing that while some things didn't change, others had changed forever. The ghost had gained a new ally, and Sam had found her own kind of voice, one that spoke through action rather than words, through strength rather than sound. And somewhere in a county jail, Snake was about to learn that his attempt at revenge had only succeeded in making his victim stronger, turning a silent waitress and her shadow-dwelling brother into a team that would never be underestimated again. The high-security prison transport rolled through the pre-dawn darkness, carrying its sole passenger to his new home. Snake sat in chains, staring out at the passing landscape that he wouldn't see again for a very long time. The evidence found in his gang's saddlebags, combined with Martinez's testimony, had sealed his fate. 25 years without possibility of parole, and that was just the beginning. Word had spread through the criminal underground about what had happened at Jerry's truck stop. The ghost's involvement alone would have been enough to make most steer clear, but it was the story of the mute waitress that really caught attention. The woman who had turned silence into strength, who had helped bring down not just Snake's gang, but Martinez's crew as well. The transport passed a familiar highway sign, and Snake caught a glimpse of the truck stop in the distance, its lights burning bright against the darkness. He remembered his first visit there, how he'd mistaken silence for weakness, how that mistake had cost him everything. His criminal empire, built over decades, had crumbled in a matter of weeks as law enforcement followed the threads Martinez had revealed. Meanwhile, at Jerry's truck stop, Sam was starting another day, but everything was different now. The diner had been fully restored, better than before, with subtle security improvements that only the initiated would notice. More importantly, Sam moved through her domain with a new confidence, her silence no longer a barrier, but a kind of power. The breakfast rush was in full swing, the tables filled with regulars and travelers alike. Many had heard the story. It had become something of a legend among truckers and drifters. They came now not just for the good food and coffee, but to see the woman who had stood her ground, who had turned her perceived weakness into strength. Marge watched from the kitchen as Sam handled the crowd with practiced ease. "Look at her now," she said to Joe, who was enjoying his usual breakfast at the counter. "Girl's got more strength in her silence than most folks have in all their shouting." Joe nodded, his injuries long healed, but the memory of that first confrontation with Snake still clear. "She always had it in her," he said, "just needed the right reminder of who she really was." The bell above the door chimed, and Ethan walked in, right on time for his weekly visit. He looked different now, more relaxed, the hard edges of the ghost softened somewhat by regular contact with his sister and this community that had embraced them both. Sam's face lit up at his arrival. She quickly wrote on her notepad, "The usuals?" "Please," he said, settling into what had become his regular booth. The other customers nodded respectfully. They knew who he was now, or at least who he had been. The ghost's reputation had only grown since the incident with Martinez's crew, but it was different now. The shadow operative had found something worth stepping into the light for. As Sam brought his coffee, Ethan shared his news. "It's official," he said quietly. "Snake's been transferred to maximum security. His whole operation's been dismantled. The FBI's using his case to break up 3 other criminal enterprises." Sam wrote, "Good. And Martinez?" "Keeping his word. He's made sure everyone knows this place is off limits." "Though," Ethan smiled slightly, "your reputation probably does that job just fine now." Indeed, the truck stop had taken on an almost mythical status among certain circles. The place where the ghost had emerged from retirement, where a mute waitress had helped bring down 2 criminal crews, where silence had proven stronger than violence. But for the regular customers, it was simply home, a place where coffee was always hot, service was always friendly, and the strength of community showed itself in 1,000 small ways. Sam had hired new staff to help handle the increased business. Young Lisa, a college student with a hearing impairment, had found a mentor in Sam, learning that communication took many forms. Old Pete's granddaughter Sarah had taken the late shift, her quick wit and steady hands a perfect fit for the truck stop's unique atmosphere. The diner had become more than just a rest stop. It was a symbol of resilience, a place where people could find their own kind of strength. Travelers shared their stories. Truckers found respite from the lonely roads, and everyone learned that true communication went far beyond words. Ethan watched his sister work, seeing how naturally she had grown into her role, not just as owner, but as a kind of silent guardian. The skills he'd taught her had been integrated seamlessly into her daily life, making her more confident without changing who she was at heart. "I'm heading out again tomorrow," he told her when she returned to his table. "There's a situation in Arizona, a small community being pressured by some unfriendly types. They need help, but the kind that won't attract attention." Sam wrote quickly. "Using your skills for good now?" "Learned that from you," he replied. "Sometimes the best way to deal with darkness is to protect the light." She smiled and wrote, "Just be careful. And don't forget about Sunday dinner." "Never again," he promised. And they both knew he meant more than just dinner. The years of absence, of choosing shadows over family, were behind them. He had found a way to be both, the ghost when needed, but also the brother Sam had never stopped believing in. As the day progressed, more pieces of their new life fell into place. A trucker arrived with stories from the road, about how word of the truck stop had spread, about how other communities were standing up to intimidation inspired by Sam's example. A young woman came in, nervously asking Sam about self-defense lessons, having heard about how silence could be turned into strength. Ethan observed it all, seeing how his sister had created something remarkable. The ghost had always worked alone, believing that connections were weaknesses to be avoided. But Sam had shown him a different truth, that real strength often came from the bonds between people, from communities standing together. Late that afternoon, as Ethan prepared to leave, Sam handed him a letter. Her notepad explained, "For your next mission, something to remind you of home." He would read it later, in some quiet moment between protecting those who needed the ghost's particular skills. But he already knew what it would say, that strength came in many forms, that silence didn't mean weakness, that sometimes the most powerful voice was the one that never needed to speak. Sam walked him to his truck, the setting sun painting the parking lot in shades of gold. The same lot where Snake had once parked his gang's motorcycles, where Martinez's crew had learned a hard lesson about underestimating silence. Now it was full of regular vehicles, trucks, cars, the ordinary traffic of a thriving business. "I'll be back soon," Ethan promised. "Try not to take down any more criminal enterprises while I'm gone." Sam's written response made him laugh. "No promises. Trouble seems to find us Mitchells." He hugged her goodbye, still amazed at how natural it felt now, how the years of distance had been bridged by crisis and courage and the simple truth of siblings finding their way back to each other. As Ethan's truck pulled onto the highway, Sam stood watching until it disappeared into the sunset. But unlike before, there was no sadness in the departure. Her brother wasn't running away this time. He was moving forward, carrying the lessons they'd learned together into a world that needed both the ghost shadow skills and the human connection he'd rediscovered. Back inside, the dinner rush was beginning. Sam moved through her domain, notepad ready, silence comfortable as a well-worn coat. The renovated diner gleamed under the lights, every surface holding memories of what had been overcome, every corner carrying silent testimony to the strength that had been found here. Marge appeared at her side with a fresh pot of coffee. "Your brother's doing good work out there," she said softly. "Just like you're doing good work here." Sam wrote, "We all find our voice somehow." And that was the truth of it. In the months since Snake's first arrival, everything had changed while somehow staying exactly the same. The coffee still flowed, the grills still sizzled, the trucks still came and went in an endless parade. But now there was something more, an understanding that strength didn't always roar, that sometimes it whispered in gestures and notes, and the simple act of standing your ground. The ghost had found his way home, and in doing so had discovered a new purpose. Sam had found her voice in silence, turning what others saw as a weakness into an unshakable strength. And Jerry's truck stop had become more than just a waypoint on a lonely highway. It was a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of family, both blood and chosen. As night fell, Sam stood at her usual spot behind the counter, surveying her domain. The security improvements Ethan had installed were invisible, but present, just like her own newfound strength. Her notepad was ready at her side, but she had learned that sometimes the most powerful messages needed no words at all. Through the windows, the endless stream of highway traffic flowed past, each vehicle carrying its own story, its own destination. Some would stop here, finding rest and refreshment, and perhaps a reminder that strength came in many forms. Others would pass by, carrying the legend of the truck stop and its silent guardian to distant places. The ghost was out there somewhere, using his skills not just to eliminate threats but to protect those who needed protection. And here, in this brightly lit oasis on a dark highway, his sister continued her own mission, proving with every silent interaction that true power often came wrapped in unexpected packages. The bell above the door chimed, announcing new customers. Sam picked up her notepad, ready to welcome them to her world. A world where silence spoke volumes, where weakness could become strength, and where the darkest shadows sometimes held the brightest hopes. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, carrying possibilities as infinite as the stars now appearing in the desert sky. But here, at this crossroads of highways and hopes, a story had been written in silence and strength, in brotherhood and courage, in the simple truth that sometimes the most powerful voices were the ones that never needed to speak at all. Sam watched the stars emerge, remembering everything that had brought her to this moment. Snake had taught her that silence could be strength. Martinez had learned that reputation meant nothing against determination. And Ethan had discovered that sometimes the greatest battles were won not through violence, but through the simple act of coming home. The night ahead was full of promise, the road ahead full of possibilities. And in the warm light of Jerry's truck stop, a silent woman continued her work, her action speaking louder than any words could, her strength a beacon for all who passed through her doors. The story wasn't ending, it was just beginning a new chapter. And this time, both siblings were ready for whatever the road might bring, knowing that they faced it not alone but together, each in their own way, each with their own kind of voice. What would you do if faced with a choice between running from your past or standing your ground? Would you have the courage to find your voice, even in silence? If this tale of siblings, strength, and redemption resonated with you, please like and subscribe for more stories that explore the extraordinary courage found in ordinary places. Remember, every shadow has its ghost, and every silence has its strength.